There is an ancient Chinese legend of an old man and his only son. One night, the old man's horse escaped, and the neighbors came to comfort him in his loss. "How do you know this is a bad thing?" he asked them. Several days later, the horse returned with a herd of wild horses. Now his friends came over to congratulate the farmer on his good fortune, but the old man said, "How do you know this is a good thing?" While his son was trying to tame one of the wild horses, he is thrown and breaks his leg. Again, his friends come over to bemoan his new misfortune. But the old man asked, "How do you know this is a bad thing?" Soon a warlord came to recruit able-bodied youth for his army, and the farmer's son escaped conscription because of his broken leg. In true fashion, the farmer's neighbors came and expressed what good luck the man had had. "How do you know it's a good thing?" he asked. I love this story because it can go on forever. Good fortune can quickly turn on you, and bad fortune may be a blessing in disguise. The truth is that human beings aren't especially good at being able to tell the difference between good things and bad things because we are so bound by our own perspective. Finitude, the theologians call it. It is the lack of a larger perspective, the kind that God has, and it gets us into all kinds of trouble. That's at least one thing that today's parable is about. Last week's gospel was about a garden, and so, of course, this week's gospel is about weeds. The kingdom of heaven can be compared to this, a field with wheat and weeds growing up together. If you try to pull the weeds too soon, you will ruin the wheat, because when you pull up the weeds, the wheat will just come right up with it. So you have to wait until they're fully developed, until the harvest. Only then can you separate them. At this moment in our world, I am worried about things. And some of those things I would even call evil. As much as I believe that it is difficult for us to know what is good or bad, and that we can perceive as that which we can perceive as bad can over time be revealed in such a way as to show us that there are actually blessings where we did not expect to find them. And I do believe that. I wonder if evil isn't something altogether different. I wonder if a global pandemic might not qualify as something that is just evil. And I wonder if those who would deny the pandemic would shirk their most basic responsibilities of wearing a mask and washing their hands might not be working in the service of evil. Or racism that is so ingrained in our society that Black children have to be taken aside so that their parents can explain to them that some police aren't there to help them, and that they might not always be treated fairly, and that if they find themselves being pulled over, they should be completely cooperative, completely submissive, because that might be the only way they save their lives in such an encounter. Racism like that, wouldn't we call that evil? And so I wonder this year how it is that Jesus would say that we should let the evil and the good grow up together. Wouldn't it be better if we could nip the virus before it ever got to the market in Wuhan? Wouldn't it be better if we could extinguish racism and greed, sexism and homophobia before they had a chance to do the damage that we all know they have the capacity to do? Back in 1933, when Japan invaded Manchuria, and many people in this country were rattling their sabers for war, Richard Niebuhr wrote an article in the Christian Century entitled "On the Grace of Doing Nothing." Richard Niebuhr was not a pacifist, and he did ultimately support the U.S.'s involvement in World War II when it finally came. He was a professor of Christian ethics at Yale University. His brother, Reinhold Niebuhr, was also a professor of Christian ethics at Union Seminary in New York City, and he completely disagreed with his brother. The reason that Richard Niebuhr argued for doing nothing was that human beings often have a way of responding to evil with acts that produce more evil, however unintended. In our determination to do something, we often act in ways that, beyond our best intentions, perpetuate violence rather than extinguishing it. He concludes this famous essay by saying, "The inactivity of radical Christianity is not the inactivity of those who call evil good. It is the inaction of those who do not judge their neighbors because they cannot fool themselves into a sense of superior righteousness. It is not the inactivity of a resigned patience, but of a patience that is full of hope and is based on faith." His idea was that even though he was in favor of not making a political or military response to injustice, he still believed that God was at work in the historical process of the world, sowing the seeds of healing and justice. In a response, his brother Reinhold Niebuhr argues in an essay, "Must We Do Nothing?" that his brother is wrong in claiming that one should only act in history from what he calls pure love ethic. Reinhold agrees that no one's motives will always be pure, but he disagrees with his brother's claims that it is better not to act at all than to act from motives that are not wholly free from all self-interest. If such purity of motive were always required, Reinhold argues, a nation would never act, for no nation can act in strict accordance with a perfectionist moral standard. In other words, both men agree about this, that even if you believe you are on the side of good, your reasons for being so may not be completely righteous. It all seems much more complicated than it ought to. There are, after all, weeds, and there are, after all, wheat. But we all know that there's not just one kind of weed. There are weeds that are harmful to crops, but most weeds are just weeds, beautiful, perhaps unwanted, perhaps unplanned for, but just weeds nonetheless. Barbara Brown Taylor, one of the great preachers of our time, rewrote this very parable. One afternoon, in the middle of the growing season, a bunch of farmhands decided to surprise their boss and weed his favorite wheat field. No sooner had they begun to work, however, than they began to argue about which of the wheat-looking things were weeds. Did the Queen Anne's lace, for example, pose a real threat to the wheat? Or could it stay for decoration? And the blackberries, after all, they were weeds, but they would be ripe in a week or two. And the honeysuckle, it seemed a shame to pull up anything that smelled so sweet. About the time they had gotten around to debating the purple asters, the boss showed up and ordered them out of his field. Dejected, they did as they were told. Back at the barn, he took their machetes away from them, poured them some lemonade, and made them sit down where they could watch the way the light moved across the field. At first, all they could see were the weeds, and what a messy field it was, and what a discredit to their profession. But as the summer wore on, they marveled at the profusion of growth. Tall wheat surrounded by tall goldenrod, accentuated by a mixture of ragweed and brown-eyed Susans. Even the poison ivy flourished beside the Cherokee roses. It was a mess, but it was a glorious mess. And when it all bloomed and ripened, the reapers came. Carefully, gently, expertly, they gathered the wheat and made the rest into bricks for the oven where the bread was baked. And the fire the weeds made was excellent and hot, and the flour the wheat made was excellent. And when the owners called them together, farmhands, reapers, along with all the neighbors, and broke bread with them, bread that was the final distillation of all that messy, gorgeous, mixed-up field, they all agreed that it was like no bread they had ever tasted before, and that it was very, very good. Let those who have ears and half a brain hear and consider God's holy word. Amen.